and socially distanced. Partners for Sacred Places is grateful and excited that you've all chosen to spend an hour of your busy day to talk with us about building stewardship in the midst of this health crisis. My name is Sarah Jones, and I'll be moderating the webinar today. And to start off, I want to say for a lot of us, I know Zoom is still a new experience, so I'm going to go over a few of its features. Only myself and our panelists are going to have access to video and microphone. So if you hover your cursor over your screen, you'll see the chat box. And if you click on that chat box, it'll pop up to the right side. And you can use that chat box to engage each other and us. And it would be great if you could go ahead and use the chat box to tell us your name and the congregation that you're representing today. For the question and answer portion of this webinar, we're going to be answering questions that y'all have. And to generate those questions, we're going to ask that you use the Q&A box. So if you hover your cursor over your screen, you'll see a Q&A box. Click that, and the Q&A box will pop up. And you can write questions at any time during the webinar, and you can also comment on each other's questions. And finally, I just want to say that everyone's internet connection may be experiencing different levels of strain right now. So if we freeze up or cut out for a few seconds, please forgive us and our internet service providers. So as I said, my name is Sarah Jones, and I'm a project manager and the consulting coordinator at Partners. And as you can see behind me, I'm based in our Chicago office. And it is my privilege to introduce our two amazing panelists this morning. Gianfranco Grande is our Executive Vice President and the resident capital campaign expert. He hails from Rome, but has spent several decades in the United States. And in addition to being our Executive VP, Gianfranco has also served on the Board of Trustees for the Council for the Parliament of the World's Religions, and has been inducted into the Board of Sponsors of Martin Luther King Jr. College of Ministers and Laity at Morehouse, and is a former chairman of the Candles Holocaust Museum. He has over 25 years of nonprofit and fundraising management, and over that time has helped faith communities raise over $80 million. Joshua Castano is our Director of Community Engagement Services and has several years of experience at Partners in helping congregations to faithfully steward their buildings through serving their wider community. Joshua began his life and career in Paterson, New Jersey, where he helped build partnerships between historic congregations and public institutions. And Joshua, what else should our audience know about you today?
Well, of course, I always like to remind everyone I'm an avid cat lover, but beyond that, and much more relevant for today, is that like many of you, I'm a lay leader in my own congregation. I'm the treasurer of an Episcopal parish here in Philadelphia. So I know all too well reviewing budgets, thinking about endowment income, writing checks, thinking about all of the financial pressures and questions that daily weigh on a congregation and its ministry.
Great. Thank you, Joshua. So as we move into the presentation part of this webinar, the three of us are going to visually disappear, but you'll still hear us, and we'll all be visually back for the Q&A portion. All right, so we're going to start off with a brief overview of Partners, who we are and what we do. Many of you know us, but some of you we may be meeting for the first time. Partners was founded in 1989 as a preservation organization in Philadelphia. Now, we're unaffiliated with any tradition or denomination, and we've worked with a multitude of faith communities across the United States. And in a nutshell, we help faith communities be the best stewards of their buildings that they can be. We assist congregations to identify the best strategies for caring for their historic buildings. We work with congregations to engage their surrounding communities and maximize their potential as community assets. And we do this through various forms of training, grant-funded programs, and consulting services. This approach has given us a great amount of knowledge in community-wide fundraising strategies, and we believe that if sacred places are community assets, then the community as well as the congregation should be emotionally and materially invested in that building. And all of this experience and knowledge has given us a unique perspective and approach to the current health crisis, particularly when thinking about current or upcoming capital improvement projects. And I'm going to turn it over to John Franco and Winston Churchill to start this discussion.
Yes, good morning, everybody, and thank you, Sarah. Many of you might think, what the heck Winston Churchill is doing here? But I think in the collective imagination and the historical reality, few people have been associated with the courage to resist and the courage to fight an enemy that at times it seems to be impossible to defeat. But also Winston was an extremely generous person. And I think it's a good omen to start saying, we make a living by what we get, but we make a life by what we gave.
So of course today there's some really looming challenges out there that we're all facing, and institutions, both government and nonprofits and a range of organizations and individuals in our communities are responding to this health crisis and pandemic. And we know particularly for congregations, there are some really pressing questions. Of course, you do what you do because of faith, because you have a faith and a tradition of faith and community that motivates your work and calls you to serve. But of course, finances and financial assets are important and are really critical to making that work happen. And so you may be coming here today with lots of questions, especially about how to stay in touch with the people who support your ministry and programs with their financial commitments. How are you going to stay connected in a time when we're literally and figuratively at arm's length? Are people going to be able to maintain their commitments or fulfill what they've previously pledged to commit either to internal stewardship, but also to capital campaigns? This is a time of great economic uncertainty, and we still have yet to see how the economic questions are going to be resolved in the next few months or even year. And lastly, for those that know that you have an upcoming capital campaign, or you've engaged already in starting a capital campaign because you recognize that your building is a major asset of the ministry and work you do, you may be wondering, how are we going to fulfill and finish this capital campaign? Can we still invest in our building? Can we still ask people to help us invest in our building with their gifts and contributions? So today's webinar is hopefully going to give some really practical guidance, a range of different options and strategies, and along with that, some inspiration. This is a great church, the Shrine of Christ the King in Chicago. What a picture. I remember taking this several years ago, standing there under basically an open blue sky. And if we want to talk about challenges, there were certainly many here. This was the church in South Chicago that burned, as you can tell. Gianfranco, would you like to tell us more about Shrine of Christ the King?
Yes, indeed. On October 15 of 2015, a severe and dramatic fire basically destroyed the building. And like today's crisis, that was an unexpected crisis. People went to bed feeling normal and woke up in a completely different situations. The good omen is that this community of faith has been able to raise from the ashes itself and restore that building, raising $3.4 million, 90% of which coming from the wide community. So we hope that the future for many of you and many of our beloved congregation can be as well, positive and with a good outcome. So those are times of uncertainty and crisis, as we've been saying. But historically, let's look at some facts. We have faced different financial crises. This country since 1901 has experienced many recession and some serious depression. Personally and professionally, I have seen a couple of those. I went through, the aftermath of September 11, the 2008, 9, and 10. I remember the one in 1987, for instance, and 1973. Though I was a kid, I wasn't working. I'm not that old. all these crises at some point end. They pass, and the difference is maybe the length of time that we'll need to recuperate. This is, in 2018, in 19, the situation was wonderful. Actually, until a month ago, everything was beautiful, and we didn't expect that. Situation has changed, but if we look at the different chart that we have prepared, for instance, the next one is a chart that will tell us more about the spreading over the year. You see that the real only dramatic drop has been around 2008 and 2010. But if you look at the number of billion that were still given in charity and in philanthropy at the worst possible time, was still way above the 200 billion, 250 billion with a B. So it's a huge amount of money. It's a very large amount of money. And that's what I think will happen. My personal opinion is that we will see a dramatic drop from the 427 billion, but we will still be discussing in the range of many, many, many billions. So there will be still resources out there. And it's important to keep things really into a financial perspective.
So we want to talk about how we're going to respond and adapt in the midst of this changing landscape and these uncharted waters. It's really great to have the information and perspective that Gianfranco has provided to show us that there's some hopeful trends, there's some inspiration we might draw from looking at the past, and some encouragement to go forward. We're going to talk in more detail about each of these bullet points that you see in front of you, but I just want to give a brief overview. Firstly, we want to encourage you to slow down, but certainly not to quit. There's not necessarily good reason to stop, although in certain cases there might be, but we really think that you can continue to do your work. Secondly, we want to remind you of the asset-based approach, and especially of the cycle of abundance. We want you to think about unlocking all the assets you have and thinking in new ways about how you might deploy the assets you currently have to support, strengthen, and continue your ability to be an asset to the wider community. Third, we want to talk about how these new realities will require change. Change is one of the hardest things for all of us to adapt to, but we hope that today's webinar will at least provide some ability, some new information, some guidance to think about how you might adapt, change, and grow, and especially what you might learn for the long term. Of course, this is a better time than ever to think about how we communicate and staying in touch and staying connected. It might look very different than it usually does at a worship service where we get to sit next to one of each other and hug and handshake, et cetera, et cetera. But this is a time to be really intentional about how we stay connected and how we listen to those who support our work the most. Of course, we want you to think about adjusting, changing your strategy, thinking of new ways to move forward, which also implies thinking differently about your timelines and necessarily adjusting your goals. Lastly, of course, we don't want you to stop being creative. Creativity is really important and also a mark of your hopefulness. When we're afraid or scared, it's hard to be creative. Creativity is something that can really empower what we have to do and our ability to meet the challenges in front of us. Gianfranco, could you say a little bit more about how we might slow down, but not necessarily quit?
Yes, Joshua, thank you. And I like your concept of slow down, but don't quit. Quitting now would be the worst possible things. It is apparently might be the easiest things to do and say, well, we have this crisis, people are not giving, and therefore I halt my campaign, I halt my fundraising effort. Wrong, you should not do that. We need to do some practical things, such as adjusting, for instance, the pledge timeline. That's the most common things to do. If you have been considering, as we always suggest to our client, to work on a 3 years timeline basis, Well, let's start to see with your team if maybe a 4 years or 5 years pledging period is the right thing to do. In some cases, you might go back, given that, and hoping that the crisis get over in a kind of soon. Then you can go back to the 3 years timeline pledges. But to say that the campaign can be done in 4 years or 5 years can also give a little bit, a good sense of a new pace to some of your donors. Another important things we always say to people is really to look at open communication with your donors and benefactors. More you love them, more they love you back. That it is a real, very important concept, because the communication and tell them really exactly where you are and what you need and what are your fears and what are your expectations of them are going to be an important force behind your campaign. Be always honest and candid about that. But also don't forget to listen. Some of your donors and benefactors not only are parts of your congregations, but they might be also people that are experiencing a dramatic drop in the size of their portfolio. So they might be sharing some of this fear with you. Then listen. It's important that we show empathy and compassion. But at the same time, let's be realistic. Some of these projects that you have undertaken are extremely important for the congregation, for the wide community. And it's then important that we do have a conversation again with our donors and benefactors and try to make sure that they understand how important it is, even with a slower pace, even if with a different pace, but the campaign must go on.
Great. Thank you, Gianfranco. One thing I want to emphasize and really encourage us to think strongly about is not to let the cycle of scarcity overtake us. I know that for many of you, your congregations have worked with partners before, and so you've probably seen our description of the cycle of scarcity and the cycle of abundance. If you're not familiar with the asset-based community development approach, we encourage you to look at the Asset-Based Community Development Institute's website, available through DePaul University, and check that out. But the cycle of scarcity, of course, is something that we see appearing all over and all around us right now. How many rolls of toilet paper really does it take? Unfortunately, that is such a common, typical way for us to think about preserving and stabilizing and really, as they say, surrounding the wagons or circling the wagons. It's a response that we always have. It's related to fear and our need to make sure that we have what we need to survive. But of course, that's a limiting cycle, and it prevents us from activating the amazing potential of our assets to do other things. You might wonder how this relates to a capital campaign, but of course, we hope that the message is always clear throughout Partners' work that we believe strongly in a community-wide approach. You are community assets. Your congregations serve, support, welcome, and connect with a much wider range of people than just your own members. And you matter and are valuable to the wider community. So now is the time to live into and continue and maintain that reality, not to forget it or to put it second. Of course, there are pressures and priorities in thinking about your own community and how you need to respond. Of course, figuring out the live stream for Sunday morning, or figuring out how to have your ministries and programs meet, or your governing bodies do Zoom meetings, etc. Everybody's thinking about that right now. But we do want to encourage you to be reminded that your building and your financial assets and people assets are still there to continue to serve others, even if it doesn't look like what you're used to. This is a great picture of the Church of the Atonement in Chicago, an Episcopal parish that has been doing really wonderful work. As a polling site for many years, they welcome lots of neighborhood people into their church. And one of the things they did most recently, at the very beginning of this crisis, was to put up flyers in their polling place. What was so touching about it was they offered everyone themselves to be there, to give a call to people who might feel especially isolated and lonely because they don't have someone else with them, to pick up groceries or get other things that people might need, especially those who felt really vulnerable and didn't want to leave their homes and felt like they couldn't get out the door to get those things. This is the kind of thing that we really want to encourage congregations to think about. There's lots of potential for new partnerships, maybe with public health agencies, hospitals, or other nonprofits. There's ways to adapt your existing ministries to serve in new ways. Maybe that might be really wonderful and that could be useful in the future. So we really want to encourage you to continue to think about serving your community. It's something that won't be easily forgotten, and it's something that's so true and so critical to a community-wide approach for fundraising.
Well said, Joshua. Thank you. And this is part of the larger concept that we were discussing a moment ago about the communication aspect. One of the things that we really face every time we work with, not every time, let me rephrase, oftentimes we work with a congregation is that their inability of really getting to the 21st century. And if I have to share a first advice is, please, this is the time where you finally get into the 21st century. Social media, no matter what people might think about it, is still a great tool for us to connect in a very wide way and really go beyond the pews and beyond what is normal our audience. So let's try to get into that. The other things is work on things that you already have at hand that you can do it safely from home and behind your desk. So for instance, the case statement, let's work on the case statement. And then maybe supported by others, let's start working on a strategy for communication. Case statement. Everybody has worked with us, and with me in particular in the past, knows how much stake I put on this important pillar of a good capital campaign. The case statement is not, let me remind you, a resume, a CV, or some sort of comprehensive shopping list that you hope to get. It's not a grant application as well. So the language should be different. And also, especially, is not a long and maybe at time tedious history of your church, your congregation, the building, and the ministry. But it is instead, and it should be, a strong and compelling narrative that really is telling the potential donors and potential benefactors who you are, where you're coming from, where you are now today, and where you want to go. Don't ever forget that capital campaigns is never about the past, it's always about the future. We look at the past, we learn from it, and we do look at the future. The social media strategy, engage the people, congregation, organization, and maybe the vendors that you already are in your circle. But again, try to widen that concept. It's really, really important. And especially nowadays, there is so much that we can talk about. And your campaign should not be in a silos, is not done in a vacuum. We always talk about a community-wide campaign. So we always consider the campaign really an element of cohesion among many different people and in a community-wide situation. So please do that. Always keep it personal, authentic. Don't be you. Actually, be always you. Don't try to be somebody else. And be always able to ask questions if you need and answer questions if questions are asked from you. How that works in a capital campaign, the ability to establish communication and opening new and diverse channel that maybe were not here a month ago, I think is going to be very important. I have learned one thing after the crisis of 2008, 2009, is that campaign changed. And I am sure that will change again after this crisis. And I believe that communication will be even more important than it was in the past. We need to look, like we said already a few times here, at different and new realities. Okay, for instance, let's finally talking about the matching gift. Many of you in congregations can ask to your employer if there is the possibility for them to match your donation, both for the capital campaign, but also for the annual giving, which is something we are not forgetting. I know that many of you, especially pastors and treasurers and so forth, they are very concerned about your own internal stewardship. Well, this is the time where please talk to your people finally again to get into the 21st century and make sure that they adopt the online giving. They have to do it. The excuses like, oh, I don't know how to do it, cannot be sufficient anymore. And maybe you have to teach them how to do it. Just let's try to do that. Another thing that I suggest is phase out a campaign differently. So break the larger goal into maybe smaller phases and over a longer period of time. In other words, if you are planning not to have a phase campaign, now have a phase campaign, and you can have the first phase if you've already done something, and maybe look at the second phase after the crisis is over, or even in 3 particular phases. Don't look at the number of money that you have to raise, but in phasing out the time, you gave chances to people to really kind of understand where they are financially and how they can support. And lastly, but very important, do what we call a holistic campaign, not only based on the simple, just the building, but look at your ministries, for instance, look how to start fund for your building, or maybe to start a small fund, a small endowment for a time of crisis, because we are seeing over and over again, crises do happen. And so it's always good to be prepared. So let's really look at an holistic campaign, which is always something helpful.
Gianfranco, can you say more about how we might find other opportunities to adapt and adjust, especially through partnership and working with others?
Absolutely. The community-wide approach is always the strongest, even in times when everything is perfect and fine. But I think in a time of emergency like now, and semi-emergency probably like after the crisis reached its peak, people will help each other. We are surrounded by good people. This is a good word. This is not a bad word. And I am convinced that working with the community will help us. You can raise funds collaboratively, for instance. Partners with the tenants that you have in your congregation. Maybe they are doing their campaign, or maybe they are considering to start a campaign. And you can put together both objective and goals to raise funds in a collaborative way. Another example, it could be joint effort with other congregations in your neighborhood, in your town. If you're in a smaller town, forget and go beyond the difference of faith tradition, work with Roman Catholic, with Methodist, with Episcopalian. Let's try to have join a union of efforts with other people. And actually, I think would be very nice to have an interfaith type of campaign. That would be really important. A community-wide project again. Maybe do partnership with other nonprofit organizations.
That's great. There's so many opportunities here to really do different things differently. And while I think we could say that's a challenge or that's the struggle, it might actually also be the opportunity. This might really be the time to step up in lots of different ways, like Gianfranco mentioned about internal stewardship, for instance, or thinking in new ways about tools we could deploy to stay connected and communicate with our members and friends, or other opportunities to use our building and activate it to serve our community. These are all, let's say, the silver lining, the important opportunities that we can take advantage of for the future, the things that we might learn in this whole process. There's nothing like a crisis to have a congregation learn about itself, or any organization, learn about who it is, what its mission is, how it's fulfilling its mission, and its vision for the future. Some of the things you might learn through this process are about your audience. How has it changed? Maybe you're connected to new groups of people. How are you staying in touch with people? Are there new ways to connect and serve? How might you use financial or building assets? What new techniques and tools for fundraising might you incorporate and might have lasting benefit for your fundraising in the future? And lastly, don't forget to take down and find some time together to really look at the long-term lessons. What have you learned? What are you learning during this time? And how might what you learn have an impact for the future of your work when this time is over? Remember, this isn't going to last forever. And how are we going to come out of this time? Are we going to be a stronger, better, healthier, more connected organization? Are we going to learn new things, do new things, have new people we're serving? So there's wonderful opportunity there. But I want to turn it over to our good friend Winston and his friend Gianfranco to give us our final thought.
Well, as you have at this point discovered, I am a big fan of Winston Spencer Churchill. And I will want to end this with another of his quotes: "Success is not final, failure is not fatal. It is the courage to continue that counts." We will experience some failing right now. Some campaign will close. You feel lonely and surrounded, but we need to have the courage to continue, because at the end of the day, there is always hope. And I think we will be successful. So thank you.
Great. Thank you both, Gianfranco and Joshua, for a great discussion on that. We are going to move into the Q&A portion of this webinar. And so you can use everyone, you can use the Q&A box to generate some questions. We already have some. So Gianfranco, Dave Ferkenhoff, I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing that incorrectly. Dave Ferkenhoff asks, we're considering suggesting extending the timeline, but also letting them know that if it's going to be a conflict between their normal stewardship gift and this campaign gift, maybe that keeping the lights on is more important. What do you think?
Absolutely. Every situation clearly is going to be different. And some of my answer, like Joshua, I presume, are going to be maybe a little bit, general. But I think it's important to readapt, like we said, the timing of the campaign, maybe put on hold for a few months if you have to, on a practical sense. And maybe in those few months, you might be able to revisit your case statement or do something else. Or start conversation with potential donors, so member of your congregation that have left because they moved away. So in other words, there are other things that can be done. And but don't fall into the concept of you are under siege necessarily. So don't be in a cycle of scarcity. That's important. I think it's an important mistake to avoid.
Great, thank you for that. So I have a couple of questions here specifically about the feasibility assessment portion of a campaign. Some congregations seem to be seemed to be ready to do a feasibility study or some feasibility interviews before the crisis happened. How is that going to impact the timeline for a feasibility process?
I think it's now more important than ever, because we will live in a different world a little bit after this crisis is over. And I think we need to do an analysis and discover what will be feasible, in 3 months, 6 months, or 1 year, considering also the difference of portfolios of your benefactors. So I think it's important to have the conversation, and maybe it will be, in my opinion, it should be a feasibility study that is not so technical, just about cents and money and dollars, but also to look at maybe the timing and maybe different ways of doing it. So I think it's important now more than ever to do a study.
Great, thank you. And Joshua, kind of following up on that, are there other things that congregations can do to prepare for a campaign, or to prepare for even thinking about a campaign in this time?
Sure. Of course, you can still think about your building and building needs. So if you haven't worked with an architect yet, especially an architect who understands and has experience with historic buildings, this is a really good time to continue working with them. They can do planning work. They can most likely still review conditions at your building and produce reports that provide critical information on the sequence of repairs and projects you might make or provide more specific detail for contractors and other building professionals who will work on your building. So you can still work with the architects. That's one thing that you can probably still do during this time. And I'm sure that they would most likely be glad of having the opportunity to continue to work with clients, because this is, of course, stressing lots of industries like the building industry. The other thing that would be good is to continue working on your cases, Gianfranco mentioned, staying in touch with people, especially those who are beyond the congregation as well, not forgetting them or losing track of them, which might be easy during this time. It can be so easy to think about how a congregation is responding to its own needs and reconfiguring everything that you might sort of leave the people outside of the congregation till later. But let's not lose sight of them. Let's not lose track of them beforehand. So there's lots and lots of work that can still happen beforehand. Gianfranco, would you want to add to that?
No, I agree. I mean, it's important to in some cases, for instance, to start the conversation. Maybe go to your community foundation and say, I know that you might have your hands full now, but is there anybody in your donor advice fund that would be interested in talking with us and learning more about what we're going to do? Really, the old proverb that says that where there is a challenge, there is an opportunity. I really believe that now is more than ever. Again, the timing might be different, might be a little bit skewed than what we expected, but I see an opportunity to make new friends right now, new partners. I think it's an important idea.
Absolutely.
It's an important concept.
Great. So Megan Corbett has a very pertinent question, and I think kind of a sensitive question. She says, I guess it's a good time right now to emphasize planned giving, and that's usually a larger gift than most can give immediately. But we have to be careful due to the scares around COVID-19. Gianfranco, how would you approach that?
And thank you, Mike, for asking this question. This is one of my pet peeves. Congregations should practice always planned giving. Always, always, always. If everybody would have done it, probably many situations would be different right now. I think it's sensible and mature when you sit with your donors right now to have a conversation about their planned giving, and maybe working with a professional, which is an advice we always give, planned giving professional, to really put together a strategy that become part of your comprehensive campaign. And when you go there and to your donor, you ask that question, if they will consider that. I understand that money is something that people never wants to talk in a regular time. When things is, I always hear people say, I hate talking about money. I don't like talking about money. But, you have to get over and have that conversation now more than ever, because we are talking about the future of your congregation, the future of your building in many cases. So it's an important conversation. And it's important to start with a bigger gift. One of the things that people always say is, well, you need to raise $1 million, ask $1,000 from 1,000 people. You will never get $1 million like that. It's much easier to get $1 million from one person than $1,000 from 1,000 people. And that's, I think, for planned giving, Mike, is the same things. You need to have the conversation because maybe they are not in a situation where they can make you the gift today, but maybe they will be in 6 months, in 9 months, in 1 year. But at least you have started. In other words, less to use amortize the time that we can't be on the road all the time, but rather have this type of conversation. That's very, very important. But don't do it just on your own initiative. Do talk to professionals. It's important. It's important because they tend to have a better, many more tools in their shed than, an individual person.
Sarah, and Gianfranco, if I just add a brief bit to that, I think planned giving is also a pastoral opportunity, to be quite frank. I'm Episcopalian, and in our liturgical resource, the Book of Common Prayer, there is actually a section of direction to priests on their responsibility to talk with parishioners about their end-of-life plans, including what they intend to do with their resources at the end of their life. So this is really embedded, can be embedded very fruitfully in a pastoral approach and in a theological understanding within your own tradition about how we help prepare people and how we help them think through responsibly what they do with their wealth and their resources.
And it's not, yes, and it's not that this end has to be tomorrow. You know, the end can be 10, 15, 20 years, 30 years ahead. Just let's be prepared. Just let's be prepared.
Great. So Rebecca Simmons has a question that I think will resonate with a lot of people. She says, we have a regularly scheduled fundraiser in October that raises significant money. We need to decide whether to cancel, delay, or move forward. And I know a lot of congregations do have annual fundraisers that might be affected by this crisis. Joshua, how do you think they should move forward?
That's a really interesting question. I'll look for Gianfranco to pitch in here too. Fundraisers are important, but there are other ways as well to raise money. And I think in a time like this where it may be a consideration, October may be far enough out that it's still safe at that time, but we don't know. This is one of those things about uncertainty. So I want to reiterate something that Gianfranco has said before, which is, fundraisers can be friend raisers. So they can be really important in terms of making connection and developing relationship. But the most efficient way to raise, and anybody who's in this work for a long time will tell you, the most efficient way is to have one-on-one conversations with givers. So I would suggest having some backup plan to, in lieu of the event, maybe you can do something that's creative and virtual, though it won't take the place of the full fundraiser, letting people know that you can't gather in person, but you might have some fun way to remind people of that, and then ask for gifts in lieu of being able to participate. I think that might be a very good strategy. Gianfranco, what would you say?
Absolutely, and maybe you should start right now. You should start right now to try to raise funds. I know it sounds like a paradox, in the deepest moment of the crisis, this guy is telling me to start raising money. Why not? That will give you more time. You will start the conversation, and you might find unexpected, support in places that you would never be able to think. Again, I also advise to really look at who is using your building a lot. They have a compelling reason, which is they want to keep meeting in your place when this crisis is over. So that would be, again, maybe a moment now to do this collaborative type of fundraising for your annual giving. That could be helpful. It could be helpful. Or maybe just do more than one fundraising, and clearly you have to adapt your situation, because we are talking about one crisis for many different situations. We might have congregations that are very wealthy and they can still weather the storm much better than others. They are in a different economic scenario. So I think it's important to talk to more people, start sooner, maybe get smaller gift, lower your expectation, do some cuts in terms of trying to save some money when you can, and adapt the new fundraising to your new needs. But don't wait. Don't wait September 30th to start thinking about that. Do it at the end of the webinar today.
Great, thank you. So Joshua, I have a kind of a more technical question from someone here. Can you expand a little bit on some simple beginning techniques to utilize social media to raise our profile?
I would say one is think about who you're trying to reach and don't rely on one tool. One tool is not going to be a panacea for your communication issues. It's likely going to be a couple of tools. So is it something, is it Facebook for certain people? Is it maybe Instagram for others? The most important thing is to know what you're going to do and to use it regularly. So make sure you have a regular schedule of posting, okay, on all of your platforms. Make sure the message is consistent, and it can be very simple. But make sure if you're going to post on Facebook, you're also posting on Instagram. It's made the same information is in your email newsletter, and it's also going to be in your hard copy newsletter, etc. Make sure the message is consistent, that you have a schedule, you keep to a schedule, you know, every Thursday morning we do this, and that it's simple, and that you have the content ready and lined up. One thing you can do, which is the best thing to do, is prepare content several posts ahead. So you may be posting, you know, today, but you know what you're going to post maybe next week and the week thereafter. And on a weekly schedule, I think is actually too far apart. I think you may want to post and share information, you know, a couple of times a week. But remember, it can be simple. You can use photos, you can do short videos sometimes, you can do written messages, and you can have lots of people help you with the content for that. Don't get tripped up too much by that content. Gianfranco, would you add anything to that?
No, you summarize very well. People sometimes are worried about social media, that kind of posting, because they think it requires who knows what every single day. It might be a little information, a little idea. You know, that'll be plenty. It's the presence that counts. It's not how big is this presence. You know, it's the continuity. You know, that counts.
Consistent, regular, exactly. Simple to understand.
So Gianfranco, Megan Corbett is asking, I think, a good question that's out on everyone's minds right now. I know this particular webinar has been about capital fundraising. Megan says, my church is not in a capital campaign right now, just annual stewardship, and we were in a really good place right before COVID-19 hit. We have been closed for at least 8 weeks, and it might be longer. And so we're reaching out to our congregation with email and phone, but you know, how are we going to keep up momentum just for annual stewardship as this crisis moves on?
That's a great question, and extremely timely one. I would suggest that you really inform people of the importance to substitute their gift. They have to do it online right now. Really use that technology. I'm sure that you already have something in place, but really invite people to do that. Another way, maybe you can form a team of people that make phone calls. Okay, so a sort of, a task force that will call everybody in your congregation. I don't know how large is your congregation, but a team of people that keep calling and suggest, look, this is what we need now, and please join. Online giving is safe. People need to understand the online giving is safe. It's not a fraud from some mysterious place, and they can do that. Don't try to do everything. Don't let the pastor try to do everything. She or he can be overwhelmed as well, also because they have to pay attention to the pastoral care in terms of spiritual needs. But to create a task force, we can work remotely. For instance, our organization, we've been working now we're starting almost our second or third week that we've been away from the office, and we have staff meeting, content connections, and you can do that as well. You can start to do that a lot.
Great. And kind of in that vein as well, someone is asking, what about the vestry and other board members? Should they begin to adjust budgets now, or should they adjust budgets as we learn more about the crisis and have a better understanding?
Absolutely. Now is the time. You act when there is the crisis. You don't wait that the crisis kills you. You're trying to fix it before. It's like to be on a boat in the middle of the storm, and the captain say, okay, well, let's see where this goes, and then we will react to that. Start now, immediately. Don't waste time. And have meetings that mean something, please. Congregations sometimes have meetings there to decide if they have to have a meeting. Just have a meaningful meeting, really. You have to readjust your budget. You have to talk about the next step. You have to consider how to behave, for a campaign. Is the campaign needs to be readjusting the timeline or whatever. There are lots of things. Start now the conversation. I think it's very, very important.
That's great advice. Joshua, Dave Ferkenhoff has another question. Dave asks, is old school letter writing still as effective as phone calls, or is it one of the tools that has kind of rusted and gone its way?
That's a very good question. So what's really interesting about letter writing is, in some cases, it can actually feel more important than it used to. 20 years ago, a mailbox would be full of junk and spam and letters from every single organization. And one letter amongst, 50 is fabulous. It's very cheap. But now the effort required to print something, post it, and spend money on postage actually makes it a little bit more precious for some people. Not for all people, but for some people. So I would say it can be effective. I would say it's not as quick, of course, and that's something to really think about. So probably the best piece of advice here is it's one of several tools, and it can reinforce communication that you're using in other tools. And it might be occasionally a very impressive, personal feeling kind of communication. So you might use it. You're right. It potentially is rusty, but people are still writing. People are still writing maybe more than ever. There's probably more words being produced than there ever have been in human history right now. In terms of communication, it's just not on paper. But that paper can feel pretty special sometimes. So it might be something that can reinforce a message that's already come through other channels and just have a unique touch to it if there's some effort spent on really making it a good presentation, I think.
Just don't ask, if I may, Joshua.
Right. Yeah. Don't ask for money through.
Just don't ask for money.
Yeah.
Just don't ask for money. Just don't ask for money on a letter.
Yeah.
The one that knows me well, they know that I like to say, you don't get milk from a cow by sending a letter. And this is something that you should never do, ask money for a letter. But express solidarity, friendship, support, pastoral attention. Why not? Just like Joshua was saying, send it to the right people, the right generation, people that do still read letters.
Great. So I have another question about foundations and granting. In this uncertain time, foundations might be extending timelines for grant applications or not. So how does the strategy for fundraising through grants change in the light of this crisis?
Well, this is a very important question, and a very important question because foundation funders are experiencing the same issues that everybody else is experiencing. Their portfolio is shrinking, and they might have to, reevaluate everything. I remember after September 11, but also especially after 08, 010, those 3 years, if you would go talk to lots of funders, they would say this is not the right time because we need to rebuild our, our basically possibility here, what we can give. It's still important to have a conversation with them. It's still important to talk to them. If they are, they've been your funders already, okay, and they are in the midst, you have a proposal for them, talk to them and ask them what is their timing, because there are so many foundations, so they can be community foundation, their family foundation, they can be private foundation, they can be extremely large funders, or maybe smaller ones. So the situation might be difficult. I always suggest that talking to them is important. And in many cases, they are also more understanding of the needs to have a different timeline to present your reports and that kind of things. Again, don't imagine that you have an answer or that you know the answer, talk to your program officer or talk to their program officer. Sometimes they put information on their website. So again, be active, be proactive right now in trying to learn what each situation is presenting.
Great, thank you. So I think we have time for one more question. And I think that a good question to wrap this up with is, how can a congregation communicate to its community that it wants to serve people in a time of great need? Everyone seems just really overwhelmed right now. Joshua, do you want to answer?
Well, the first thing I think is to consider what friends you already have in the community. Do you know elected officials, your council person for your district, or county elected officials if you're in a more rural place? Who do you know in your network, first of all? Could you write a message to them about what you have to offer in terms of your building or your members, what you're looking to do, and you want to be helpful and connect? I would say that's the first part. And where you might have already there, what people you might already know as a congregation. Two, social media might be a place. If you do have a Facebook page, for instance, or your website, that's another place to put a message out to your neighbors. Don't forget to update that website and let that information be there about what you are doing. The other thing is, I think signage could actually be really useful. People are still going outside to take walks and get needed exercise. That's another way to communicate with people. So this is a kind of a communication question. I would also say always ask when you're trying to communicate with the external community. Always ask them, what do you need? How do you think we might be helpful? What are some things we could offer to be helpful to you? So I would try to include a question there as well.
And I would like to end with one comment. Please don't stop your annual pledge drive. Please don't stop your annual pledge drive. And don't abandon your campaign. Adapt it, study a new strategy, but don't abandon either the campaign or your annual pledge. This is not the time of doing it. You will reap the good effect of that later on, and hopefully sooner rather than later.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, thank you, Gianfranco and Joshua, for such a great presentation. Thank you to all of our attendees for the great questions. I'm sorry if we couldn't get to all of them. You can still contact us with questions you have or requests for more information. I'm going to type Gianfranco's and Joshua's email addresses into the chat box. And also, I would encourage you to visit our website, which I'll also type into the chat box. And you can always reach out to us with any questions you may have. I also want to say that we will be sending out these slides next week to everyone who attended. And you'll also see a survey from Partners for Sacred Places. We're sending out this survey to congregations to find out a little bit more about the specific challenges y'all are facing right now, as well as some new opportunities that y'all have found, so that we can get a better sense of how to help you in this time. So I want to thank you all again, and we'll stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope that you find some fun this weekend.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
I really appreciate this opportunity to talk with you all. And of course, there's going to be more questions, so feel free to reach out to
Call us, email us. We will try to answer everybody. Thank you.